Hello, Annalee.
Hello, Junior. How are you doing?
I'm good. And please call me Jay.
Jay. Okay.
Yeah. I well, it's been at least 10 years. At least 10 years that I've made a decisive turn to Jay instead of Junior. Long
Okay.
story.
Okay.
Anyway, we're more concerned today with your story than mine. Um, so you can begin by introducing yourself, I suppose, telling us about your Barbadian roots, your regional roots, your global, international standing, work at present.
Okay. So my name is Annalee Davis. I work as a visual artist. I was born and raised in Barbados and um, went to primary and secondary school there. Um, at the time when I wanted to go to university to pursue um, visual arts, I'm so old that there wasn't a degree granting program at that time in Barbados. So I
Okay.
went I went to the United States for my first and my bachelor's and my master's program. And then I came back in 1989 and I started teaching at St. Michael's School for a couple of years. And then after 2 years, I decided that I wanted to meet my peers in some other Caribbean countries because I felt a little bit isolated as a young contemporary artist in a country without a national art gallery or a contemporary art museum. So I started to meet some of my colleagues in the Anglophone and the Dutch and the Spanish Caribbean. And then I started teaching at Barbados Community College on a part-time basis for an extended period, um, on and off up until 2018. Um, and I'm currently on a fellowship in Germany in the western part of the country. Um, and basically looking at this extended time here as a fallow period, a period of kind of reflection and reading and research and experimenting with work and meeting people and preparing for a few exhibitions that are upcoming in September at the Kunsthal Charlottenburg in Copenhagen, um, at a place called Karst in Plymouth in the south of England, and then at Mendes Wood in Brazil. Um, so continuing to work on my practice and uh, you know I often am doing work outside of Barbados because that's where I can get support for the work that I'm doing. Um, so yeah, just continuing to make my work as a visual artist, and and being here in Europe for a few months this year.
Okay. Now, I'm going to come back to what you said about being there because that's where you can get support for your work. I think that's a point we want to explore a bit. Um, Certainly, as someone based myself in the UK, in England,
Mm-hmm.
um, and this is a concern that is raised repeatedly by so many Barbadian creative persons
Yeah.
and persons of a more technical
Yes.
vocation as well. Barbarians of all walks of life, really. We're,
Sure.
we're used to going beyond our shores in search of opportunity. So we're going to come back to that. But I want to go back to the start and Annalee at school. Um, Now, according to my research, you were based in Christchurch in the Graham Hall area. Have I got that right?
I was born there. My father, at that time, that was a state owned sugar plantation, and my father worked as the manager of that
What
plantation.
Would that be the Balls Plantation?
No, it was Graham Hall,
It was
where the
called Graham Hall.
Ministry of yeah, where the Ministry of Agriculture is now. Yeah, that was
Oh
the
yeah, okay.
yeah, yeah.
Is that like neighboring the Balls Plantation, or is that much further away? Balls Plantation.
I don't think those lands abut and abound each other. No, it is. If you're coming on the highway, it would take you down to Top Rock. So
Yeah.
it's just off the highway, and the Graham Hall Swamp would be just west of.
Hmm.
So it's on the coast.
Yeah.
So the Graham Hall Swamp is there. But yeah, that's where I was born, and I lived there for the first 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No Carrington's Village roots.
No.
Okay. There's the Codrington Plantation over that way, and for some reason I got it in my head that you might have links, but I might have been. I think I was reading Lamming at the time, and I know that's
Oh,
where his roots are. So I
yeah. He's Carrington. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. He's Carrington Village. Yeah.
yeah. As am I.
Okay.
Um, in fact, uh, he he would have lived in one of the neighborhoods pretty close to me, St. Hills
Oh.
Road.
Okay.
I lived at St. Hills Road for a bit, School Road, Quakers Road,
Uh huh.
and then in the Ivy for a bit. So but that's another project. So where did you go to school? Primary school, secondary school?
So primary school, I went to Mrs. Davis's primary school, which was a private school in Maxwell. She was family to my father, and that was, I guess, from up until 1973 or four. It was a private, all-white primary school on the south coast, and then I sat the 11 plus, and I went to Christchurch Foundation School
Mm-hmm.
um, for a year because my mum went to school there. And then my parents transferred me to the Ursuline convent.
Okay.
And my family are not Catholic. Convent is obviously a Catholic school. It's
Mm-hmm.
just closing after over 100 years now.
Yeah, well, I've got an interesting story about the Ursuline convent. We might, we might,
Ah,
we might have a little chat about. I visited in 2018 or 2019. I visited, um, and I was a bit surprised to find out more recently that they were closing.
yeah.
Um, anyway, um, okay. Um, so and I've got a story as well about foundation school.
Okay.
I I I have the I think it was my penultimate year or my final year at the Garrison Secondary. It would have been my final year. I was a prefect, I think, and I visited foundation school and spent a very interesting period sitting in the girls'
Where you weren't supposed to be.
where I wasn't supposed to be, but they thought it was fun. I thought it was fun, and we had some very good conversation. But yeah. So but I also wanted to explain to people viewing who will be viewing this video that we're improvising here because of some technical difficulties with the my team's account.
Okay.
So as we say in Barbados, we ain't got horse, so we riding cow,
That's
and
right. Lollipop something.
yeah, and just to capture the moment, which I thought, as I said to Annalee, gives it an added dimension of talking point, and reflects some of the messiness of life that we all have to
That's right.
contend with.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I know you'd appreciate that from an artistic point of view. Um, and we can segue from from here, I suppose, back to that point we were making about the challenges. I mean, so many writers, Lamming, Naipaul, Caribbean writers, talk about that, and Uh, you could if you want to expand it even further within the United States and other places here in the UK. The there's this pattern of leaving to to succeed. Um, your thoughts on that? What do you think?
Well, I know that about 70% of tertiary educated people in Barbados emigrate. So the state is investing in primary, secondary, and tertiary level education, but they're not reaping the benefits of it. Um, so that's a huge problem because it's this problem of brain drain, which we are suffering from. I think there's also a sense that if you leave, you're better. It's better to leave, you know?
Mm-hmm.
That sometimes I think people feel that if you stay, there's maybe a sense of failure in that staying. And I was part of a generation of artists that were starting to come back. Um, and so I came back in 1989, and I've since in the last few years published a book that was edited by Teoretica, an artist collective in Costa Rica, by Miguel Lopez. It's called On Being Committed to a Small Place, and it's kind of um, reckoning with what it means to feel a profound connection to and to be, in love with the place that you are from or you choose to inhabit and work in, and all of the frustrations around that. And I was just reading recently. There's a James Baldwin quote that societies never know it, but the war of an artist with his society is a lover's war. And I think that captures it quite beautifully because it's not easy as a contemporary artist to be living and working in the Caribbean, but I don't feel called to reside elsewhere in the world in the supposed magnetic north or these kind of global artistic kind of urban spaces in the north. Um, so yeah, I think that I guess, well, it's a very individual choice. We have to decide where we feel that we can do the work and where we belong and where we want to be. But for me, the Caribbean is my place, and that's where I'll always be.
Okay. And the Caribbean as opposed to just Barbados?
Yeah. I mean, as a contemporary visual artist, there are not a lot of us in each of the islands, right? So to feel a sense of belonging, it's been necessary for me to sort of spread across the archipelago. So a lot of the work that I do as a cultural activist engages with the Spanish, Dutch, French, and English speaking Caribbean as a strategy for survival, but also um, these are my peers and these are the people that I respect and whose work I'm interested in. These are the people that I collaborate with and shape community with. And I think each of the islands are too small for critical mass in this particular field that I'm in. So that has been necessary, but it's also been very joyful and so much for me to learn outside of the small bubble of Barbados. The Caribbean is a complex and polyvocal space that I'm still learning about and learning from. So, yeah, I very much see myself as a Caribbean person. Yeah.
Uh, okay. Um, one of your contemporaries, Ras Akem,
Mm-hmm.
Ras Akem, and Ras Aishi Busher,
Mm-hmm.
two of them. But I interviewed the two of them a few years ago, some years ago at least, well, when I was still in Barbados. So this would have been pre 2006, when
Okay.
I was still based in Barbados. And was writing then for the Caribbean News Agency.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but more recently, and I touch base with Rasakim every now and then, uh, and at one point he was very distressed because I think his home had been burgled, or you're familiar with that incident and
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, it's
And his material.
Sorry?
Yeah. His materials were taken, his paints, and
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I don't remember the details of it very well, but I can remember his distress. Uh, and we've had the scenario with Rihanna, or local global pop icon, and the challenges she's had with infringement of her copyright by a relative. I don't know if you're familiar with that situation. So there's this there's this idea that Barbados, and some might say the Caribbean, is a place where dreams go to die. A bit harsh. Um,
It, yeah. Yeah. It's a place that can drive you mad.
mm.
Yeah.
I laugh because England has that reputation as well. In Barbados, there's this story of there's there's this thing of people going to England and coming back unwell.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you're working as an artist, I mean, you talk about like, yeah, going in like a graveyard or something. There are a number of artists who have produced significant bodies of work, and that their craft and their um, intellectual contribution to Caribbean civilization has not been revered and taken care of in the way that it should be. So people like Akim and Aishi, who have produced an extensive body of work, who artists that have something to say. Um, I sometimes feel it shouldn't be that hard. It shouldn't be that hard, and that there should be more respect for the work of visual artists of that stature. Um, it's appalling that we don't have a National Art Gallery or a Contemporary Art Museum. While there is a collection, that collection often sits in storage and doesn't tend to see the light of day. The role of a Barbados National Gallery or a contemporary museum would be to display these works, to um, uh, produce scholarship on these works, share them as the national cultural patrimony. But because they sit closeted, it means that there is a chasm between the local audience and the work that's being produced. So most of the work that I make is shown outside of Barbados. So my audience, my local audience, and the place from which my work uh, is, um, is evoked from and is concerned with and provoked by doesn't get to be seen in the place from which it originates. And I feel like this um, quandary uh, is connected to the plantation and the orphanhood that the plantation elicits in its the way that it operates is that it severs um, the umbilical cord in every way. So there is a profound disconnection. Um, I often um, remember when I'm having these kinds of conversations, Lloyd Best, the Trinidadian economist and thinker, um, speaks about how the Caribbean is one of the few places where the economy preceded the society. And I find this is such a peculiar statement. I mean, when you think about a place that is formed economically rather than socially, this is a very strange thing. It means that we're all cogs in a wheel. And so our social evolution was not something that concerned the settler colonial mindset. Um, and I think the continued inheritance of that means that there is a certain kind of abandonment. And so I feel that people like Akim and Aishi and many other contemporary artists who are serious about what they're doing can feel a sense of abandonment in a place like Barbados. Um,
what a few things came to mind as you were speaking. One, um, that George Lamming spoke to this abandonment, severing of the umbilical cord, and so on, but within the context of our parliamentary system. And I can't think the exact words of the quotation, but he talked about the system, our particular parliamentary system being, you know, detrimental, uh, inimical to um, the development of the people. Um, I'm trying to remember the exact words, but he spoke to the loss of human capital, and that term might sound crude, human capital. Um, I'm remembering now as well and what the late Owen Arthur said about political capital relative to the arts and culture when he took over the culture portfolio from the then minister, who's now the Prime Minister of Barbados, uh, Mia Motley, when he took over the I don't know if you remember that, she was Minister of Culture at the time, and he took over that portfolio and said, basically, if there's one portfolio that the Prime Minister should have, it is the cultural portfolio. And so he made that direct connection between the arts and uh, the creative industries, as we call it these days, and the politics of the place. So, uh, which and we're going to come to the space, and which is why I reached out to you, because of what the work you're doing uh, now as an activist and raising awareness about a building project there, and you can tell us more about that. But I want to frame it within the whole context of that severing of umbilical cords and that that disruption, uh, in not just in the historical context of colonialism and slavery, but in the very contemporary context of what's happening around family life and issues of gender and sexuality and transitioning and the quest for identity. Now that's a lot I put on your plate there, but you take your time and work through it.
I've so maybe I'll do this in a tangential way, but I was recently reading a book by a French Caribbean writer. His name is Malcolm Ferdinand, and he's from Martinique, but he's based in Paris. It's called Decolonial Ecology, and he's looking at the environmental crisis through the lens of the Caribbean. And he said something about how much of the world has what we refer to as a motherland. So China, Africa, Asia, Europe, South America. But Barbados and the Caribbean, through the plantation, have lost that motherland. And it has been, I think there's this um, kind of male way of uh, exploiting land through the plantation system, which has severed our connection with literally the ground beneath our feet. And so the task at hand is quite profound because, you know, and I mean, you know this, the fact that Barbados was flat meant that it was very easy for it to become an entire plantation, unlike the cockpit country in Jamaica or the mountains of Dominica. And as Kamal would say, the gullies and the rablands were the spaces where, I guess, the potential sites of fugitivity or marronage within enslaved community, because really the entire thing became a plantation. But so I think the idea of disconnection really comes from the plantation. And I was so interested in that phrasing that we've lost the motherland. And so the plantation that tells the story, the dominant narrative about the economics of the sugar industry, means that the peasant story in relation to soil and a connection to the earth has been lost. And that has also been reinforced by the church. You know, this notion of dominion over rather than a relationship with the land. Um, and I guess that transition from the plantation to tourism economy has continues to bury the stories that sit beneath the soil. So there's this further entombment, I guess, through that transition from the plantation to tourism. And how do we feel connected to who we are? Like, where are the ways in which that happens? So this kind of disconnection that happens, and even when you mentioned the creative economy, like I have a real issue with that, you know, because we want to talk about exporting the arts and seeing the creative economy as an income earner, but we're not creating spaces that to nurture artists. You know, I think often that people that are writing policy and legislation around the creative industries or about culture are profoundly um, disconnected from the life of people who are making art as musicians or writers or visual artists or dancers or people in theater. I don't think they really understand what that it means to live that life. And so again, it's like the plantation, it's like the tourist economy. Now there's the creative economy, which is about extracting value, but it's not about nurturing. It's not
Well,
about nurturing.
now, and you're coming back again to the that family issue, nurture, and parenting. Um, that there's a bill, and I just submitted a written. Um, they were soliciting, calling for written submissions, and I submitted one just yesterday, because for me this is axiomatic. This is fundamental to any enterprise, any ambition, any aspiration, whether as artists or technocrat or bureaucrat or whatever. Um, this whole uh, question of who cares. Now, did you read the careful conversation I did with Selma
I,
James?
I can't seem to access it.
Ah, okay.
So, yeah, I don't think I have full access to that platform.
Okay, now that's interesting. Academia. I, well, usually it would be a case of signing up, but then my journey being what it is, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some gremlins at work.
I mean, maybe you can share it with me as a
Yeah,
kind of.
but the point I raised here is one I raised there with the Marxist feminist analyst Selma James, wife of C.L.R. James, and oh, I also thought you made a reference to Kamau. Just for those who might not be familiar, that's a reference to Edward Camel Brathwaite, a for many of us, father poet, nation poet, who's currently there are efforts to nurture him uh, post mortem, well, even before he died, and to nurture uh, others who laid the foundations of the current um, cultural awareness. And whether you think of it as commodification of cultural industries or whatever, um, what I asked Selma when we met um, was the role of women in the nurture. She's famous for a campaign to get women paid for their unpaid work, housework, the nurture, the the care of the home, the private,
Yeah.
the,
The
the
less visible.
the less
Yeah.
visible. Now, the difficulty, it seems to me, is that some things are meant to be less visible, invisible, because of the questions of modesty and privacy. And I think sometimes we get confused. Like I did a few, I did a few gender courses with Dr. Eugene Barreto and others in the Center for Gender Studies. So I'm familiar with Mary Wollstonecraft and other people and the whole notion of the private is political uh, as part of the feminist liberation effort. But I do wonder at times if we go too far. So the lack of nurture that you lament might be the result of a confusion around what should remain private and what should be made public. What do you think?
I mean, when I speak about nurturing in the context of being a visual artist, I'm not necessarily speaking about what happens in the private home. I'm talking about the role of the state in, um, if you want artists to come from all sectors of society, then there needs to be um, platforms that allow that to happen. So you've got Barbados Community College, which is the art program is really struggling there, not for lack of dedication from the people that are teaching. um, it's a kind of a difficult context to work within. There are very little resources for people that are teaching there, and it has contributed significantly to the development of arts in Barbados through the music and performing and visual arts and fashion and so on. But it doesn't get the kind of support that a department for the arts should have. So, and then, I'm not sure if I can raise this now, but the development of fresh milk, the platform that I established in 2011, was absolutely in response to um, my work at BCC as a part-time tutor, and realizing that within a year of most of the students graduating, almost 100% of them were not making work. And so the state is investing in this program, but they're not investing in a kind of a bridging program. There's nowhere for these students, many of whom are coming from middle class, lower middle class, working class homes. Families can't just provide them with a studio. So there needs to be a mechanism in the society for people to be artists and to function. There's no publishing houses, there's no um, auctions, there's no trade fairs, there's no biennials, there's no gallery, there's the bookshops are selling, how to be better. I forget what the term is,
Motivational.
self, yeah, these motivational things, very often that are couched in Christianity. There isn't an ecosystem that is set up to support people working in the arts outside of musicians performing in hotels or whatever. Okay, there's an economy of scale issue. It's a small country, um, but I mean, I just feel like we can do more. We've got to do better than this.
Well,
We've got to do better than this to nurture people in the arts so they can continue to work and not then just go and wait tables and sell clothes or whatever they're doing. We need to find a way to support young artists.
and I'm inclined to agree, but I go back to the point, this public private dichotomy, because okay, the prime minister, um, announced just recently, either before or after the pick of the crop finals, about the support for artists, for the creative sector, and you know what government will be doing in the future. Now, there's a risk, isn't there, of being too close to the state as an artist, and if you're a creative person, how much space, how much room is there for criticism of the government if you are essentially on the government payroll, to
Well,
lesser or greater degree?
yeah, I mean, I think that there should be arm's length. I don't think that if funding becomes available, it doesn't mean that artists need to be a gramophone for state policies. But at the moment, there's almost nowhere to get funding for artists. If you don't have a primary market, there's very few people that are collecting artwork in Barbados. The few serious collectors, I think, are exhausted. They don't have anywhere else to put the work that they're collecting. If you apply for a grant from the National Cultural Foundation, the money can't go to artists. So for example, if I apply to the NCF for a grant, which I did to rebuild my website, that money can't come to me for any work on the website. It goes directly to the service provider. So you can't, in places like where you are in the UK, if there's the Arts Council England, you can apply for money maybe every 3 to 5 years, and that can maybe cover some of your operating costs, or you can get grants to be able to produce a major body of work. How else are artists going to live? And it doesn't mean that you have to be a spokesperson for state positions when you receive funding from them. But there aren't philanthropic donors in Barbados for the arts. There aren't private collectors, really. They're very few and far between. Um, there isn't an endowed chair at the University of the West Indies that is producing scholarship on the arts. So how is this field growing? People are making work, and there are a lot of young people that are doing very intelligent work. Um, but it's very difficult for people to continue to function, and it's those that have the that have the determination and the perseverance that can continue. But it's a very hard slog, and not to say it's not like that in a lot of places. Yeah, it's difficult, but I think that we can be doing better. I
Mm,
think that we can be. I don't think we have a history of nurturing in the Caribbean. It's not. I don't think it comes naturally in some ways, and I think we have to learn. I'm in Germany at the moment, and I'm being told that Germany has some of the best support for people working in contemporary art. So the fellowship program that I'm on here, which you can apply to from anywhere in the world, provides housing for up to 6 months and a studio space, and they provide a stipend of between 13 and 1,500 euros a month. So people can come here, and it means that you can buy food, and you can focus on your work, and it's a supportive environment. You have your peers around you, and in opportunities like this, it becomes a kind of like a gestation period where you can develop like new ideas that can um, like fertilize you for a period of years. And we also come out of a space of like this pressure to be productive all the time. And I think the plantation is very much about that. Like, you always have to be producing. And I think being in these uh, kind of more nurturing spaces can allow you to have new ideas and new thoughts, and to experiment without the pressure of like a marketplace, for example. And so people in the Caribbean are happy to get on a plane and go to the theatre in New York, or to museums in London, or fashion shows in wherever, but they don't think very often about what what it means to get to those places, how people operate, and how do you function as an artist. think we're missing out some of the bridging between graduating from UE's creative program or BCC's creative program to become a professional. And unless these people are going to emigrate to find something better, we need to think about how we're going to keep them home.
The, the program that you're on, the fellowship you've got, do you know of any other Barbadians that have received that
Oh
award?
no. Oh no, no, no. No, absolutely not. So I've shared the open call, which runs until the end of August, and I know a number of Barbadians have already applied, a couple of writers, and so I'm hoping that Caribbean people will flood the application process this year, and that we'll have more. I mean, I have been here with people from Nepal, from India, from Hungary, um, from well, obviously from Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, Iran. So it's an international platform.
Many
Um,
Africans,
a woman from South Africa is here at the moment.
black or
Uh,
white South African?
black,
Black
black.
South African.
Yeah. So I mean, they do need to have more global South people here, I think, and I think that will happen as those of us that are here will continue to share it in our networks. I think they're going to have more people coming in from the South.
Do how do you identify black Barbadian, white Barbadian?
I was raised as a white Barbadian. I think at the time at which I was raised, it was very much a binary. You were either white or black, and I certainly benefited from being raised as a white Barbadian on a plantation. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I learned that on my maternal side, there was a mixed race. My maternal grandmother was the product of a white woman and a what was termed at the time a colored man. Um, so I've been kind of working through the word Creole, um, but in fact, there is mixture in our family, but for all intents and purposes, I've been raised socially as a white Barbadian. When I move through the Caribbean, I'm not seen as white. Barbados is the only place where I'm seen as white. But in Trinidad, I would be seen as red, in Jamaica as brown, in the US as Latina. But I have been raised as a white Barbadian.
Okay. Well, I can tell you what recollection I have of you because I remember the face even in my relative old age. But I would have thought of you as a white Barbadian. And as much as anybody might have told me, or this person isn't white, or I have to say, it wasn't until I was living here in England that I got a sense of the nuances,
Of race.
you
Yeah.
know, within the group that we might call white, um, the gradations
Right.
of,
Yeah.
that can exist.
Hmm.
So yeah, so it's I want to address. It's come up a few times as you spoke the role of the church. I want to come back to that because that's been a significant part of my own journey, both in positive and negative terms. My faith is very precious to me. It's my faith that that uh, that is the wellspring of my resilience amidst the lack of nurture that I've suffered in Barbados.
Yeah.
The But it's not a conventional faith. I was, I was for many years, a number of years, initially linked to People's Cathedral and Reverend Holmes Williams. But before that, I would have had sojourns among all sorts of churches in Barbados as a visitor at Adventist churches, Wesleyan churches. I think my brother and I attended an Adventist summer camp at one point for a bit. Wherever we could get in, maybe get a free lunch, or go, or just spend time with a friend. you know, um, but in my teens, I made a decisive commitment to the Christian faith, and then departed from that a few years later. What's your spiritual journey been like? How well do you identify as an atheist or?
Well, I was raised in the Anglican Church. My parents are, quite involved with St. George's Parish Church. So that's what I was raised in. I can't say that I felt a profound connection to, or particularly, yeah, I can't say I felt really connected to that. Um, so I don't practice within any organized religion. I trained just over 20 years ago in yoga, in Kundalini yoga. So I got training as a Kundalini yoga instructor, which I felt offered some kind of feeding of, the spirit. The yoga is the idea of yoking mind, body, and soul. And I was really interested in chanting in the practice of yoga, like the repetition of words and doing that collectively was something that I really enjoyed. And trying to learn how to meditate has been important. I have found the church in Barbados, I guess, historically tied up with a lot of the problems, in terms of its support of the slave trade and its attempt to have moral positions on people's lives that have are connected to empire and its interest in policing intimacy and fostering madness. So I think there was something called the Poor Relief Fund, which you probably know of in Barbados, where poor white families could access money through the church, but it was attached to a moral code. And if you were a poor white woman who had a relationship with a black man or a child that was biracial, you were struck from the Poor Relief Fund. And so even though we know that our lives are profoundly entangled, um, the church and the state tried to create laws that didn't allow for that to happen. Um, and I think this has caused a lot of damage, in Barbadian and Caribbean society. And its position on the LGBTQ community, the fact that people that are queer feel that they can't be themselves in Barbados, I think is just unforgivable. Um, and so I don't adhere to the tenets of this way of policing uh, love, and relationships. So I don't practice or participate. What I do think, though, that is sad about that is that there is a desire for people to feel connected to something greater than themselves. And my own journey at this stage of my life is thinking about a form of pagan holiness or secular blessings. This is what I'm actually trying to work on while I'm here. And that connection for me is with what I guess is often referred to as the natural world, but really this forming a kinship with the phrase that is used more often now, the more than human world, this kinship with everything around us, and that this notion of dominion that the church has taught us, dominion over the land, has fostered a disconnection from the land, and that we think that we can just use the land to extract things from. And just, today I went to visit a very, very small garden of a man called Werner, and in his small plot, um, he is making tinctures and teas and balms and is drawing on old traditions of how to work with plants. And so I feel that I'm interested in what Karen Armstrong calls the sacrality of all things. And I don't use the word atheist or agnostic. I don't know. I don't feel drawn to these labels. Uh, but I'm working through the messiness of it all. And there's no roadmap to follow. Um, but just, yeah, exploring other ways of being and connecting outside of organized religion, because it never felt, um, it didn't feel like home.
Mm, mm. Okay. Now, I could easily go from that last comment to, and I will, to what Whitney Houston is reputed to have said or reported. And have you seen the Houston movie? Uh, I watched it for the first time last night. I didn't get it from the star, but and it ties in with what we've been saying about nurture and the need to nurture the arts. The abuse she suffered at her father's hands, um, religious and economic, um, and not just her father, her husband, and others around her. The most positive portrayal in of those around her was of her girlfriend, arguably, who was a lesbian and who's portrayed as a lesbian, uh, not involved with Whitney, but you know, having a lesbian lover. Um, this Whitney kept returning to this theme of home. Where we're at ease, where we're free to be ourselves, and it goes back again to the privacy. There is, and I blame the media. I so blame the media, and I put my hands up as a journalist because I've transgressed in this area as well, um, in the name of uh, a story or in pursuit of a story, perhaps going too far, prying too deeply, this kind of thing, into private, insoluble mysteries, enigmas, and that's the word that come out. I remember him talking, saying he hopes we respect his enigma, his private space, kind of
Right.
thing. Um, and the how do I frame this? Um, it seems to me that's not just the church violating the sacred space. It seems to me political parties do it, the media does it, Marxists, atheists do it, fundamentalist feminists do it, the gay gospel people are doing it, the transgender rights are doing it. And I think the uh, the whole battle around the label woman um, right now is indicative of the 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 dangers that the dangerous place that we're at, and from my perspective, the earth is groaning. The creation you talked about, the sacral. What was the phrase you used?
The sacrality of all things.
Of all things, yeah. Now, um, if you we can give that, if you like, an African or ancient African or I, I dare say ancient European um, interpretation. We can trace We can trace all these things, I think, to any human community, tribe, in ancient times, because it seems to me these are lessons we keep learning and relearning and forgetting and then relearning, and working out our collective or individual salvation at the expense. That's the cost of the forgetting or whatever. But it's important because I think today, well, let me ask you: don't you see? Do you see? Do you see um, some? Do you think we might be dealing with the consequences of this forgetting that we do? This either selective, opportunistic, or innocent forgetting.
Yeah, I think that there's, I think that my work is really about the impact of the colonial project. So I kind of keep going back to that. And I think we're forgetting who we are. I think that we have an illness that is a result of this profound estrangement from the land and from each other. And maybe I've been in Europe since May, and I've been to a number of exhibitions in cities, and I'm seeing the presence of the global South and the Caribbean and Africa in ways that I have never seen before in the global North. And they are bringing ritual and tradition um, and connection in a way that I have not seen. I mean, I went to school in the 80s in the United States, and there was nothing familiar in the art history or in the galleries that I was seeing at that time. And now, everywhere that I go, I'm seeing the presence of the global South. I'm not sure exactly how I feel about it because it's being shown here and it's not being shown in the spaces where it comes from. But what I'm observing is this desire for ritual and connection, um, and that is to heal the rupture of estrangement. And maybe we have to look back at some of these traditions. I mean, even in Barbados, I feel there's a greater confidence post Black Lives Matter movement and COVID within certain areas of Black Barbadian society where people feel more confident to assert themselves and their relationship to African tradition. And even if a lot of that information has been lost because it was handed down orally, maybe it's a time to create new rituals and traditions that are inspired by, but will feed us in different kinds of ways. I mean, even at the state level, they're beginning to talk about we should have flights to Ghana, or they're, be trying to, like, why do we have to fly to London to get to somewhere in Africa? This is ridiculous. We should be able to have a direct flight from Barbados to the west of Africa. Um, and so I think that we are suffering from profound estrangement. My daughter is at school in Rotterdam, and I was saying to her when I was working there for a bit as a curator for an exhibition in June, and I was walking around the city, and I said, "So, how do people unwind at the weekend? They shop. You shop. You buy things.
Retail therapy. It's called
Retail
retail therapy.
right? Now, I find this very stressful. I find it very stressful. It doesn't feed me. What I do at the weekend when I'm in Barbados is I go in the sea. And my Holy Communion is taking in a Julie mango or a golden apple and taking the skin off with my teeth and dipping it in the salt water and putting my head under the water. And I feel that I have been blessed and renewed and rejuvenated. That is
Amen
my
and amen.
right. That is my Holy Communion on Browns Beach.
Yeah.
So the notion of going in to shop as my weekend activity would drive me insane.
Uh-huh.
So I really very urgent moment, and we need to think about this.
Yeah. Well, um, the, we can't explore forgetting without exploring forgiving, because in my thinking, the two the two are interlinked. Um, and I heard it recently. I heard it years ago, but I heard it again recently. The forgiveness is a very abused word, and certainly the church has done a very poor job in many ways in its teaching on forgiveness. It's been a simplified, um, it's and the calls for an apology over slavery, I think, points this out. How hollow, you know, for what forgiveness can be, um, but yeah, it's so important, and well, the scripture says 70 times 7, and so there's a sense of persistence. It's not a one off.
Right.
You get triggered by things. I've got to be. I'm still forgiving for things happened in
Yeah.
the 80s.
Right.
As you might be as well.
Yeah.
Certain people can bring, and certain events, even something on a film, something that seems totally, can trigger you. So for the healing that is so urgent, um, requires a better grasp of what forgiveness entails, I think. And this whole question of reparations for transatlantic slavery and colonialism, does that negate? I'm still waiting for a proper discussion on that. I'm particularly on the whole question of black on black violence, the role of Africans in the slave trade as traders. I'm not here. I'm still waiting for a meaningful conversations. There've been a few, but it's tended to be I think there's been more of a perpetuation of divisive black white rhetoric, uh, this bipolar thinking, and I think you use that term, the binary the binary difference, that's exploited by demagogues
Mm-hmm.
and pedagogues of one ideological strain or another, whether religious or secular.
Mm-hmm.
And I also want to engage with you on what you said about the role of yoga and Hinduism, meditation. Uh, Now, you wouldn't identify as a Hindu, would you?
No, 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 no,
No,
no.
but I might there be an argument that you're familiar with the Hindu nationalism of Narendra Modi.
Oh, of course.
Okay, so there might be an argument that the the prevalence of yoga um, globally might be the thin edge of for some, of an agenda that is not as transparent
Mm.
as it could be. What do
Mm-hmm.
you think?
Um, yeah, I mean, I see what's happening with nationalism in many places, not just in India.
Mm.
There was a horrific video that was going around in the last 24 hours of a teacher in a school in India who was getting her students to slap a young Muslim boy across his face in the school. Um, and so yeah, we're seeing the rise of nationalism and the return in some ways of fascism in spaces around the world. And of course, I mean, I don't subscribe to any of this, and I think it's very worrying. Uh, um, do I feel that my practice of yoga is tied to that? I don't. not quite sure. I think I probably need to think about that question a little bit more. I've never thought about framing it in that way. But yes, I mean, they're cults in many places.
Yeah.
And I think that it can be, whether you look at Jim Jones in Guyana decades ago, or cults around yoga and ashrams and abuse that happens within them. Absolutely. I mean, I think that when people come together and there's power and charisma and followings, that yes, there can be abuse, and it happens. But um, yeah, I don't know. I also feel very heartened by a lot of young people. I'm glad for young people. I
Mm.
think that we've thrown them a really shitty bone. Like, they're inheriting a really, their future is in peril. And there was recently a case in the United States, in one of the states, where young people are bringing a case against the state, and they're winning, for their future being threatened because of the environmental um, fragility, as has happened in Portugal. And so I think that young people are more aware in some ways, and are feeling anxiety around these very pertinent and potent and urgent questions of the time. I mean, I'm surrounded by younger people who are choosing not to have children
Mm.
because they want to, but they feel they can't bring them into the world. I mean, how terrible is that?
Well,
You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah.
There's an
Well,
anxiety about their future, and it's not so far away.
well. The Miss Prime Minister Motley's most recent press conference before she took a 10-day leave. Um, that's one of the things I've been looking at, and she's discussing the national insurance scheme dilemma, and she talked about the Barbados's dwindling population. Now, for me, I see a clear link between that and the runaway excesses of what I call fundamentalist feminism. Um, in the Barbadian context, having been in a public forum and hearing a fully grown male, adult male, talking about the legitimacy of giving a grown woman a correctional slap occasionally, I can understand why we are where we are. I can understand why the pendulum has swung as far left with among certain feminists. But and I've been speaking to Peggy, what's her name,
Antrobus?
Antrobus, and others about this, because for if we're going to acknowledge the gains of the feminists, we've also got to take responsibility for the failings. And I think I identify as a feminist. I've worked with the United Nations Women's Program on the Convention for the elimination of all types of discrimination and violence against women and different things. So I'm proud of my feminist credentials, but I do think whether by media expediency or political expediency or whatever, that a lot of the difficulties we're facing now are a consequence of that. Um, if you listen, you haven't seen that press conference, have you?
No, I'm not sure. I don't, or is it, I don't think I'm following what this particular incident that you're referring to.
No, there's the these thoughts were prompted by what you said about the the young people not having children.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got aging populations, and according to Prime Minister Motley, this has been the case for at least the last 40 years or so. I can't
Yeah.
quite remember.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and it's because we've not been having children. But then Matt Fingal, he, he, he put a finger on it as well some years ago when he said, no Bajan. Bajan men didn't want to marry Bajan women. And he was talking, you remember that song? It was about the leaders, the prime ministers, and the higher ups and better offs, how they
Uh-huh.
couldn't find a wife in Barbados.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So so
Yeah.
so that's part of the that's a factor of the whole thing as well. Well, you these would have been people who traveled and met foreign women and married
Right.
foreign. So
Yeah.
there's that as
Yeah.
well. It isn't
Yeah.
necessarily a personal thing. I
Yeah.
married an English woman
Right. Yeah.
myself. That's why
Yeah.
I'm here in England.
Right.
So
Yeah.
there are different variables. I don't want to reduce it to but I do think the our population crisis, and for me it's a crisis. What we're seeing with the NIS and um, it's indicative that the pendulum may have swung too far. You might agree or disagree.
But I'm not sure what that pendulum is. Are you talking about feminism as a way of thinking?
I'm talking about excesses of feminism, excesses of feminism that
I mean,
that are implicated implicated in the 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 tendency of some males to identify as females because for them that's where the power is, that's where the control is. um,
are you talking about trans people?
and trans people is in some cases, in extreme cases, but also in husbands who are fathers who I heard one one elder, heterosexual male, or he might be homosexual, saying, no, this is women's time, and so go for it girls kind of thing. uh, it's, to me it's as dangerous as the whole this is India's time or this is black people's time. uh, there's a risk of it feeding simplistic nationalistic narratives.
Wow. Okay. I'm not sure that I'm following that.
Yeah,
For
it's a
me,
complicated argument and it's not a very well publicized view, which is part of the problem. Um, the populist narratives don't address these variables. This nuanced view of things, it doesn't sell papers. It doesn't um, get get the masses out marching. And if that's what you're after, if you're after mass action, if you're after hits on social media, if you're after um, money from one secular or religious flock or another, you're not going to
yeah. I don't know.
nurture.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I remember a couple of years ago when we had a female president, DPP, and prime minister. Somebody called in on the radio program